This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Nick Simmons. Nick is a co-founder and a member of Octu Ventures. Octu Ventures is a venture DAO, a member-driven venture DAO that is investing in teams that are building on Urbit. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alex. Good to be here.
Thanks for coming on. So you contacted me. You were interested in talking a little bit about Octu Ventures, but not only Octu Ventures, but also Octu's main investment focus, or really the core investment focus, being Urbit and Urbit related companies. So just to get started, Nick, could you give us a little bit of background about yourself and how you kind of got involved in the Urbit ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've done a bunch of different stuff, but probably the thread to pull on here is that I have quite a long experience running nonprofits, doing nonprofit governance, serving on boards, running community institutions, that kind of stuff. And I was in the music business for a while, and we had a nonprofit music venue. I worked in nonprofit cooperative housing for a while, and I learned a lot about how to run or not run a nonprofit, and this was experience that I, thought I was probably going to leave behind for a while. I moved to the Bay Area. I had a bunch of creative projects I wanted to work on, but I got sucked back in, and around 2018, 2019, I ended up helping do some of the very early preliminary planning for launching the Urbit Foundation. And so this is the period when Urbit was getting close to the technical point. I won't call it maturity, but that there was going to need to be, an entity that would fund more and more core development as Tlon was becoming more of a product company. This has since pretty much happened. They're separate entities. And so I came in to help, guide some of the P's and Q's around how you launch an independent protocol foundation. Anyone that's familiar with the history of crypto in the last decade knows there's a bunch of, landmines there in terms of like protocol foundations that have gone pretty awry. There's a lot of things not to do. What's maybe lesser known is that the legacy, nonprofit and foundation world's not necessarily that much better. I think maybe some of the failures are just, more quiet and well hidden. So there's a lot of things to do and not to do launching a foundation. And once I understood what Urbit was as a protocol, as a product, as a an ethos in the techno-historical context, I got very much sucked in. And I ended up spending about 3 years at Tlon, which is the main company that incubated Urbit from the get-go. I was the head of community. Later, I was the head of special ops, which is kind of like partnerships, macro research, kind of weird stuff, figuring out where we lie in the overall technical landscape. I left about a year ago, and one of the main projects I've been working on is my former Tlon colleague Kenny Rowe and I launched Octu Ventures, and we'll get into a little bit, why Octu, why a venture DAO, why now in a moment.
And so for those listening, what is Urbit?
Right. So this is the perennial question. And, Urbit is a series of tubes. Urbit is, there's a lot of joke answers there. But fundamentally, and I've had a lot of, practice explaining this, or at least attempting to over the years, is Urbit is basically 3 core pieces of technology. So you have Urbit OS, which is this clean slate rewrite of everything up from not quite bare metal, although there's a very cool project. Shout out to the Knock FPGA by Mopful Winrux, which is an Urbit name. We'll get into that in a second. Who's attempting to actually put Urbit on bare metal to build a chip. But basically, Urbit is a full stack computation. The Urbit OS is a full stack computation environment that runs on top of any Linux environment and Unix environment, I guess you could say. And so it has an instruction set called Knock, and then it has a higher level programming language called Hum. And the key objective with the Urbit with the Urbit OS is basically to make something that is extremely simple and stable. And this has advantages in terms of making it easy for developers to develop on it, but also in terms of it running a personal server. So Urbit, the Urbit project overall can be phrased as a decentralized network of personal servers. What are they serving up, you may ask? They're serving up any kind of data, whether that is, to a decentralized protocol that replaces maybe e-commerce or social media or something like that, or maybe it's serving up data to a blockchain, or maybe it's serving up just your own little website or chat server or anytime you want to share data with other users, the idea is that server maintenance should not be difficult. Right now, server maintenance is quite difficult. It's it's a full-time job that people study for, people progress in as a technical discipline, and that's led to the bottlenecking and the centralization of a lot of things that rely on there being server architecture that you use to talk to your friends, to sell a gadget on eBay, to load a video and have people watch it or download it. That stuff is all bottlenecked on the fact that it's quite complicated, technically and eventually financially to run a server. So the point of the simplicity of Urbit OS is that it's a stable computing environment that lets you run a personal server and you don't have to be technical. The other two parts of Urbit Stack are Urbit ID. So Urbit ID is and this applies to both the infrastructural nodes and the end user nodes in the Urbit universe. So there are essentially three main tiers of nodes. There's galaxies. So there's 256 galaxies. And then those are the kind of the root nodes. And so it's almost like if you tokenize, an IPv root node in the current internet architecture. And so those are they're kind of the DAO that runs the whole network, that makes important networking decisions. For example, there's one point that we decided that we needed a roll-up solution. So this is all on Ethereum, by the way. These are Ethereum NFTs. In fact, fun fact for the crypto nerds out there, Urbit ID was actually the first or second ever implementation of ERC 721. So as a technical standard. And so these are all NFTs technically. These are NFT identifiers, and you get to hold the private keys of any of these nodes, and then you get to use the public key pair to demonstrate who you are on the network. So decentralized, not your keys, not your identity. And so the Galactic Senate is 256 root nodes that determine major upgrades, and one of these was allowing for layer 2 rollup of the star and planet address space. And that brings us to the next point, which is about 65,000 stars. And the stars are kind of like ISP, or kind of like community shelling points for packet routing and peer discovery. And then there's about 4 billion planets, and these are intended to be the end user identities. So you and I, really most of what you need is a planet. Now, all these are running the same Urbit OS, so it's not like the actual computation is different in any of these things. It's still a virtual machine that runs somewhere. It's all quite the difference between the different kinds of nodes is basically what they do on the outputs of that, and what kind of permissions do they have, what kind of data are they supposed to route. And then there's also some ancillary cases. There's comets, which are ephemeral identities, and then there are moons, which are subordinate identities to a planet. And there's a lot of interest in using those for things like IoT, but you could also think of them as kind of permanently tied subordinate identities. Maybe your kids before they turn 18 could use a moon for some purpose. And then the third part of the Urbit stack that I think is really a little bit underappreciated is AIMS, which is the networking protocol. And so this is a decentralized peer-to-peer networking protocol, and it's hierarchically peer-to-peer. So there's three main stages, as I mentioned. There's the galaxies, the stars, the planets, and the importance of this is also kind of underappreciated, I think, because in a traditional peer-to-peer system, like something like BitTorrent, right? So you're sharing a bunch of files, you're sharing, small fragments of files, and they're identified with a hash, their contents. More likely than not, your BitTorrent client is looking for two things. It's looking for from its peers, hey, do you have this part of this file that I need? And secondly, what's your upload speed? How available is it for me? That's not at all the same thing as me saying, hey, I'm in the Urbit network and I want to find Alex. I want to find Alex's, planet or star identity and then talk to him. Alex is a unique person. You're a unique person. I don't need to just download, part 37 of 54 of a bootleg Harry Potter movie. I need to actually talk to you, and I need to find you and talk to you in real time. And so flat peer-to-peer is slow, is basically the upshot of this. Hierarchical peer-to-peer, where you have the ability to, your planet talks to a star, which then says, "Hey, where's Alex's planet?" and then routes
Mhm.
that path back down to me and routes the message to you, is the overall point of hierarchical peer-to-peer. And so, taken all together, the dream here is that you have a decentralized internet, basically a computer network. I don't want to, load too much on the current definition of the word internet, that routes around damage, that
What is
allows you
damage?
to. So damage in this case would be if a star is offline, your planet has the ability to go find a new star sponsor to be under, and
Mm.
its default rate of exit on the part of the planet. So if you have to have a star sponsor, but there's almost 65,000 star sponsors, so you can easily go and find one, and the star sponsor doesn't need to release to you. You just choose to go.
Mhm.
Um, this is also true for the star to galaxy relationship. So if a galaxy is offline and it's
Mhm.
sponsoring your star goes and finds a new galaxy sponsor. And I actually wrote a piece about this a while ago, a couple of years ago, on the Urbit blog that people can look up, called "The Missing Middle." And basically, one I think underappreciated upshot of this is that you can have a bunch of you can have kind of like a broad spectrum or continua of community norms in terms of what are the behaviors or the allegiances or the purpose or the conditions of buy-in to be a planet under a star or a star under a galaxy. And so Urbit is this pluralistic internet
Mhm.
where you choose the local conditions that you want to be part of, but you're also part of a global network effect namespace and computer network that you can communicate with people in a very trustless way and know who you're talking to at all times, even if the software that you're shipping or the communities that you're participating in have very little to do with them.
Hmm. All right. So you've got this decentralized peer-to-peer computing network that's running as a virtual machine on these on Linux kernels. And you've got this sort of DNS-like addressing system. You've got this messaging protocol. You've got these nodes that are hierarchical with the planets and the galaxies. And uh, my next question, I guess, would be you've taken this up as like a sort of fundamental ecosystem. And before we sort of get into like the long range vision for the future of Urbit and its impact on civilization or humanity, I wanted to sort of circle back to Octu and ask you some of those questions you mentioned earlier. Why a member driven venture DAO? Why now? Why Urbit, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So the fundamental thesis that we go into any investment decision at Octu with is probably a good place to start here. And we essentially think that Urbit is a fundamental technological primitive that allows new things to come into existence in a product or protocol or business sense that weren't possible before. Uh, Put very simply, Urbit is coordination technology. And when a genuinely new coordination technology comes along, it generally unlocks a huge amount of value, again, because there's things you just couldn't do before. So this was true with the interstate highway system. If you can travel rapidly between place to place, then you can start shipping goods faster. People could eat different kinds of vegetables. I guess refrigeration was also kind of a coordination technology in a weird way there. The internet itself, of course, going all the way back to the ARPANET days, quickly coordinated resources and information and social connections in a way that even the original architects of it didn't foresee. And then when you had the integration of, payments, and when the internet was, consumer friendly enough for the normies to come on, you had things like eBay, and then you had things like Uber or Airbnb, where a bunch of siloed physical and financial resources got to network with each other on a protocol. It was a centralized protocol, but it was still a massive, massive value unlock. And there were massive, amounts of business potential to be had in building those rails and those tools to do that. And so we think that Urbit is similarly a technological, paradigm that you can build on top of, like TCP/IP or Linux, or even just the concept of a blockchain. And so we think that we're very close to that Netscape moment or that Red Hat moment. And
Mm.
there's been a lot of focus so far on Urbit as a culture, Urbit as a ethos, and that stuff is great. And I think Tlon has done a great job of shepherding that. And I think the Urbit Foundation has as well. And I think that we wouldn't be where we're at in terms of there being a developer community, there being a cultural community, there being an audience for people to look at this stuff and critically evaluate it. I really think the Urbit community is like, extremely, extremely high quality, especially compared to most crypto communities. And we wouldn't, that's the foundation that we're building on. That said, we think that right now, the way to get Urbit to mass adoption is not to sell the very idealistic, very high touch qualities necessarily. It's to show how you can build on Urbit in a way that you just can't build another technology, from a very prosaic angle of how does this give a startup or a protocol competitive advantage against its competitors. And
Mm.
so, the year of the Linux desktop for normies never came.
Mm.
Linux is still in all those Android phones. Linux is still powering, all these corporate servers. There's lots and lots of both venture scale and just, kind of value investing type businesses that are built on Linux. TCP/IP, I mean, I don't think we need to go too far into that one, but
Yeah.
obviously browser companies and e-commerce and platforms all required that to unlock a whole bunch of siloed value, customer demand, et cetera, et cetera. And so we want to find the companies that are in that embryonic stage right now. We're very much seed, pre-seed stage investors that see a particular vector, a particular use case for Urbit that lets them outperform and lets them get around some of these roadblocks and access siloed demand, siloed resources that, there's a great book called What Technology Wants by Kevin Kelly. Highly recommend if anyone hasn't read that. And there's I don't entirely buy that there's some like intelligent teleology. I think Nick Land also kind of believes this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
But there's something there. And I think sometimes you see a piece of technology that kind of emerges out of this latent desire, and then it starts to coordinate people. And it's really, it's six of one, half dozen of the other, to what degree that it's sentient, but it can really give that impression sometimes.
Mm.
Uh, and then to follow on with that, why a venture DAO, and why now? And these are kind of related. So the first thing is that the venture DAO model, it just has a bunch of advantages in terms of coordinating people and capital across a wide variety of boundaries. Penny, my co-founder, has quite a bit of experience with this as a member of Metacartel Ventures and then Hydra Ventures. Hydra Ventures is a DAO of DAOs, so they incubate venture DAOs like Octu. We're one of their first incubations. They've been super helpful.
Mm.
But in the case of Urbit, the really um, the really compelling part about being a venture DAO is that as you could probably tell, given that there's these three kind of foundational parts of Urbit, and there's all these different places that the Urbit stack can touch, there's a huge amount of possible, attachment surface to build something on Urbit. So you can build, a user-focused platform at Urbit. You can build infrastructure on Urbit. You could build Urbit IoT, hardware, crypto integrations, financial integrations.
Yeah.
And yet it's still a pretty, nascent ecosystem. So if we were going to start, a seed stage venture fund that focused on Urbit with two guys, which is the relevant, size of a seed stage venture fund, given the size of the investments we're making,
Mm.
we'd either be out of our depth most of the time, or we'd simply pass on stuff because we didn't have the expertise to evaluate every single, widely varying and often very technical prospect that came across our plates. So the venture DAO model is great because we can pull in lots of extremely experienced and knowledgeable urban engineers, founders, and people from other crypto ecosystems. I mean, we have several people who are partners at crypto venture funds who are Octu members on a personal level.
Mm.
We also have a couple of actual funds as members. They just they delegate somebody, and we can really benefit from that breadth of expertise to do mostly, I'd say, due diligence and deal flow. So to evaluate opportunities and say, okay, I have domain expertise here, and this makes sense or it doesn't. And we've already seen this. We've had stuff that touches ML, or we've had stuff that touches consumer social, and we evaluate it often on the basis of having someone with that relevant experience come in, from the membership of the DAO and say, okay, this works, this doesn't. And this is important because there's a lot of investor interest in Urbit right now, but so far it's been kind of a binary thing of like either you just don't invest, or there's a very lumpy handful of possible opportunities. There's address space, and we can get into by the way, we don't invest in address space in terms of just an asset. We only invest in tokens or equity from a project, from a company or protocol. We think the alpha is there. Address space has been out on the market. We all hold plenty of it personally, and we think that definitely there's a lot of potential there, but we think most of the alpha is in actual projects. And then there's been a handful of companies that have raised so far, Tlon, Terrell, et cetera. But we are offering essentially a basket of every Urbit company that is going to raise, in a venture sense, is going to come across our plate. We've seen quite a few pitches already, actually. We've made several investments already we can get into. And we feel really good about this as essentially a sense-making and kind of, long-range, deal flow aspect for the ecosystem.
And before we get into some of the specific implementations, I do have a question for you about one common objection to building in the Urbit ecosystem at all is that, you've talked about how there's a kind of a paucity of basic, applications and services that we are already familiar with the general internet in Urbit. And so there's obviously a lot of opportunity there, but one of the common objections to that is like, why do I want to reinvent the wheel on Urbit? So another way of putting it would be like, what are the things that I can do on Urbit if I go build, just for example, an instant messenger or a social network or something like something we're very familiar with Web 1 or 2.0. What am I getting that's different when I'm doing it on Urbit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing I would say there is that there's a lot of things that we don't expect to be replicated from Web 1 or 2.0 immediately on Urbit, because there is a lot of inertia from those legacy, incumbents. I don't expect there to be, an Urbit social network in the same sense that Facebook or Instagram exists anytime soon on Urbit, or if there is, I don't expect it to take off, honestly. So I think you have to look at the areas where legacy alternatives either don't exist and there's latent demand, or they're failing and there's a way around that on Urbit. I think it's also worth looking at this from two different perspectives. There's the consumer perspective of, what is an experience that we can make happen on Urbit that is, hard or impossible right now on the legacy internet. And then there's the builder perspective. There's the founder perspective of, I want to do X, Y, and Z thing. And it could be novel, or it could try, to compete cleverly with some incumbent. But what's the spin-up cost? What are the long-term dependencies of building on the legacy stack versus Urbit? And so just to take these in turn, I think that from the consumer side, and this is kind of related, because to be fair, there's a whole lot of projects that are on Urbit that are really cool, that are just, they're not investable and they're not trying to be. They're not trying to be, a scaling venture-sized business. And that's fine. And we actually very much think that there's going to be a big market for things that are scaling, venture-style businesses that serve a lot of lifestyle businesses, that provide connective tissue, financial rails, all that sort of thing. And so the more lifestyle businesses, the more hobby projects, the better, because we think that there will be an interstitial layer there that we do want to fund. And this goes back to one of the key propositions of Urbit, which is that it's really easy to ship an MVP app on the Urbit network. Software distribution and DevOps are orders of magnitude easier than on the legacy internet. Add that to the fact that Urbit has native crypto integration. You literally have a cryptographic identifier. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do that allows people to have cryptographic identity, reputation, payments, along with, again, an order of magnitude easier lift in terms of developing and shipping the software out. That makes it very attractive for people versus, you have to spin up a whole bunch of cloud buckets, you have to run your own servers, you have to comply with a bunch of data privacy stuff like GDPR, which is another topic that's very interesting in the context of Urbit we can get into. And that's very attractive to founders, we found. From the consumer side, the other perspective here is that, okay, what can't you have on the current internet? And I think we're close to seeing people start to really use the power of Urbit to do this. And I would say the big opportunity here is, again, Urbit's potential as a coordination technology to coordinate resources and people in ways that don't go through centralized choke points. And I think that the thing that's been immature, and the reason we haven't seen as much of this as we might have, is that Urbit needs reputation tooling. And so we're actually, we're seeing some very impressive efforts in this right now, and I'll have probably some news in the next month or so to announce about this that I can't currently share. But I've personally been very bullish on this for a very long time, that once you have reputation tooling and identity and really like granular identity, along with some ZK tools eventually, that you're going to see the potential for hosting resources on a personal server, cryptographic identity, cryptocurrency payments. You start to see this as the missing OS and coordination layer for a crypto native society, just like it says in the t-shirt. And I think that so I think that, you're going to see a pattern of low-hanging fruit, things that people want that are completely, unobjectionable and have latent customer desire start to appear on Urbit. And the faster that the identity and reputation pieces happen, the faster their clear superiority to, either a bad Web 1, Web 2 alternative or simply a non-existent one is going to become clear.
And so what are some of the problems around identity that
I mean, so right now, okay, there's a couple things to mention here. So first of all, legacy identity sources, whether that's a credit report, whether that's your driver's license, whether that's any of the things on the internet that try to approximate this based on some sort of KYC process, there's been a lot of hacks, there's been a lot of data breaches, and they're also pretty lossy when it comes to the fidelity of what they actually say about you. And so I did a deep dive on this a couple of years ago. I looked at a lot of the digital identity protocols and providers. I came away pretty unimpressed. And in my experience, there's two main failure modes that these things fall into when you're trying to really bootstrap a robust, digital identity system that avoids legacy dependencies. The first one is when you have relatively good architectural tooling and so forth, but you don't bootstrap your identity stack in a place where people are using it as their primary online identity and or doing relatively high value things with it that will build an empirical record that you can actually bootstrap off of. So this would be an example like you build a great identity protocol, but you can't get people to adopt it in a way that will essentially build up an empirical, blob of reputation against people that want to defect from the game theoretic equilibrium. Ergo, the identity reputation that you build up there doesn't mean anything. It's not trustworthy. And then I think the second failure mode is themes, and many of these are not even trying to be a digital identity stack, which is kind of funny that they've almost, they've at least accomplished half of the problem. Scenes or protocols or platforms, use cases where there is a compelling use case and there are people doing high value stuff and they're really putting their whole digital identity into it, but they're not capturing it in a way that that is replicable or high fidelity that can be bootstrapped into something that's kind of more of a civilizational primitive, a civilizational stack you can build on top of. And what needs to happen in Urbit is basically just building out the tooling, because we really have the use case. It's a full stack computer and a full featured digital network, and we have quite a few apps that people use, and we have the ability to get, so given that the Urbit virtual machine, Urbit OS, it's a fully deterministic virtual machine. So you can run it backwards, you can prove all the computational events. And it's not, it uses a block, Urbit ID uses a blockchain, but it's not itself a blockchain. So you can choose where to verify. You could, write events to any chain you want. You could use other data storage protocols. You could simply have mutual webs of trust inside Urbit where you say, okay, I see your computer, ran this event, computed this function, and I'm going to attest that at this point in time, maybe tie it to a time oracle. And so there's a lot of ways to build systems of attestation inside Urbit that allow you to construct a really granular record of who you are, what you've done, who you've done it with. And then I think another missing piece that I do see people working on right now is making it so that this, can be pseudonymized, but probably via zero knowledge tooling of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are the pieces that get us to the point where we can say, okay, I'm going to interact with a whole bunch of different protocols. It's funny, this keeps coming up. Every time I talk to somebody about this, they talk about the circles feature in Google Plus, which got sunset a long time ago, which is the ne plus ultra of, you want a consistent digital identity. You want your reputation to come with you. You do not necessarily want to push the totality of your digital self into every encounter you have online.
Right.
And this is something that actually this is one of the things that pulled me into Urbit in the first place. So 15 years ago, I was running a music venue. I was booking bands, and I was deep in the music scene, and Facebook came in. And this is not when Facebook originally rolled out, but this is more when they started to eat the entire events market. So every event that you want people to come to had to be a Facebook event. And I noticed something, that when that happened, the amount of interpersonal drama around any kind of live music went way up. And it was because if you had, a spat with somebody over politics or a personal argument, and it spilled over into Facebook on your wall, on their wall, in groups and Messenger or whatever, all of a sudden that was tied to the identity that you used to say, hey, I, one person, am going to the show tonight.
Right.
And those were publicly, visible event logs of who's going to the show tonight.
So there's no partition between the different parts of your private life.
Yep. And when this started happening after a while, fewer people came to shows. It was bad. It was bad for the actual IRL, community. And you see this now on the internet all the time. The tribalism and the very, stark divisions between people come from the fact that you've got a handful of, you can call them digital identity providers. They're social media companies, but fundamentally they allow you to attest to a bunch of things you believe. And the default is towards you bringing your whole self and saying the things that are demanded of you. And the more we can get away from that, the better. However, we've seen a lot of people go in the totally, privacy maximalist direction. I think that maybe 4chan is the best example of this, at one extreme, where everyone's an anon. Okay, that's great. And I think that actually has an important role to play as a kind of wellspring of free speech, of unfettered, cultural expression. 4chan is almost like the id of the internet.
Right.
But you can't build a society on that. Nope. Nobody wants to live in the 4chan suburb. And what you need is, as crazy as it is to say, the Google plus circles analogy of you need to be able to come with some implied zero knowledge reputation into a space, prove your minimum viable credibility, and then silo your experience and your empirical reputation in that space from all the others.
Hmm. So you need to basically have a way to fragment your identity in these different spaces while also having it persist over time.
Yep, exactly. And you need to do this on the group level as well as the individual level.
Hmm.
And you need to have mutual attestation, mutual circles of trust, that then can have their own, let's say, diplomatic relationships with each other. Say, hey, I'm part of this tribe over here, and I don't agree with everything that tribe B says, but hey, 30% of the time, or in this particular, case, we're good with them. We'll let them into the first concentric ring of our hill fort, if you will.
Hmm.
And one thing that we think about a lot at Octu is the idea that all civilization is moving online. Like it or not, we're in it now. When I was growing up, I will absolutely cop to this. I was not one of these kids who was programming computers from the age of 5. I was not somebody who necessarily thought every single thing was going to move online. Uh, I'm just old enough to remember that people thought the internet was a fad, and
Hmm.
I I spent a long time, I think, as very much a kind of tactile, IRL offline person, if you will. I studied writing. I studied dead languages. I still have way too many books in my house. I like working with my hands. Uh, but the conclusion was ultimately inescapable, that there's actually nothing that can't become information that can't be uploaded to a cloud server. We're working on it for the biological use cases. We've got the fruit fly connectome uploaded. Is that a fruit fly? I'll leave that one for the metaphysical types. But certainly we've come a very long way in a very short amount of time. And when it comes to human interactions, I mean, we're most of the way there. I'm in San Francisco. I'm talking to you
Hmm.
somewhere else over a video call. It's pretty good quality. Um, the the uptake of remote work was, obviously precipitated by COVID, but it happened very quickly. Uh, and that suggests that, there's a whole bunch of factors that seem like they seem very solid until they're not, that prevent more and more of society from having this digital uptake function. And it takes one black swan event, or it just takes the, grinding, profit motive to wear away at them. And we look back after even the perspective of 6 months or a year and realize that even more of society is online. And that all leads to the question of, okay, if we're uploading society this quickly, are we actually uploading some of the Chestertonian fences that upheld how we ran society before that, or are they just getting lost?
Hmm.
And I'm a little bit of a cynic about this. I think that there's no good reason why any given precept that was encoded in our pre-internet offline social technology, if you will survive if it's not encoded in digital online network technology. And the
Yeah.
more yeah.
Well, that does raise a question though of like in my mind, one of the questions I have is like I can understand I can understand the analogy. I can understand wanting to bring good ideas from meat space that are time tested back into the digital space and needing to do that very consciously to make sure that they get there. Um, I guess a few of the curious things I would say is like the way that a lot of these precautions or heuristics, whatever you want to call them, developed in meat space was often some combination of trial and error and fortunate accident. And a fortunate accident that then turned into a rule for the future. And so one question that I just have is a sort of more of amusing than anything is how many of these things are we even consciously aware of versus that we just take for granted as built into society automatically, but that we might have to actually think very hard about rediscovering and transferring to the online space.
Oh yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that we are like, we're woefully unaware. It's the Dunning-Kruger, question. We don't know what we don't know about how society is set up and the immense pile of trial and error bodies, if you will, that we're all stepping around on top of. And I don't think that that's a problem that technology can necessarily solve. What I do think is important as we construct technology today is to at least give people the ability to upload their own heuristics and to build and the malleability of the tools they build, and especially the tools for constructing communities and markets and networks, that they even can instruct those designs with the rules that they're aware of. And my major point here, though, is just that if we don't give this proper consideration, that if we don't build tools and we don't build tools to build tools even that allow people to make these explicit decisions, then there's nothing that guarantees that a lot of the things that we find important or sacred or load bearing in our pre-internet, or I would even say our early internet community ethos, are the ground rules, the ground technologies of how we run society. There's no reason to think those things will persist. And I think that the dividing line may not even be between no internet and internet. The dividing line may be more around 2008, 2010, when you have the rise of mass platform economies, and you also have the final degradation, I think, in the face of financial incentives of a lot of the more kind of like user friendly, if somewhat technically complex tools of the old web. This is when you start to, RSS is maybe the paradigmatic example, when RSS still works. It still works fine. You get no visibility because the sense making, the search engines, the discovery tools, the media platforms are not incentivized to treat it as a first-class citizen.
Right.
There's, it's almost like the inverse of security through obscurity. It's obscurity can wash away all of your intent, all of your good, design decisions in a wave of financial and behavioral and attention-based incentives.
And so Urbit is an opportunity to begin porting over some of that hard-earned knowledge and run these sort of community level experiments.
Yeah, and so I would say that Urbit is a tool building platform fundamentally. Again, it allows you to spin up software quite easily and then ship that software out to, again, self-sovereign nodes on a network that can run it. They can fork it if they want to. There's a very interesting discussion that's going on for a while in the community about what a fully, fleshed out Urbit world does for SaaS, because a huge amount of the SaaS moat is just a combination of technical complexity and then bureaucratic dominance fueled by a winner-take-all financing environment. So you have a SaaS platform, it goes hyperscale growth. It can pay for the server farms and all of the both, I guess. Now that we've commoditized cloud hosting, you're paying for the AWS engineers, but that's still a lot of money. And then on your side, you're paying for the engineers that actually keep your services and website and APIs running. And then, of course, you've got the GDPR moat to make sure that you're safeguarding customer data effectively. And then all of this gets bundled into a package that clears a credibility bar for venture capitalists to invest in. And so this is a big ball of wax in terms of the technical complexity, the financial burden, the regulatory burden. And the moat is that, plus it's the fact that you own your own data on your customers. They're interacting in a walled garden. Their identities are generally just inside your walled garden. I mean, my Twitter username is just a line in a Twitter database, eBay, et cetera, et cetera. And in many cases, they're even doing their own fraud prevention for credit cards for new customers. There's an interesting conversation there around onboarding friction versus actual fraud prevention that crypto probably has something to say about eventually, although certainly it's still the Wild West in some parts of crypto. And if you reduce these burdens, if you don't have to store customer data centrally, so but greatly lessened, if not entirely obviated, GDPR burden. If it's extremely easy to ship software that simply works and doesn't have all these legacy technical dependencies that require you to hire hundreds of or thousands of SREs, site reliability engineers, and if you don't have to pay for cloud hosting en masse because everyone is running their own Urbit node, then what is your SaaS mode? And my best conclusion to this is that we're going to see renewed attention on network effects. So it's still growth, but it's essentially, what is the plus EV of your actual users of participating in a given network, and I think that trends more to protocols. And then it's going to be what is your data mode? Do you have interaction data, probably ZKified from your users? Do you have a real world source of data? Are you pulling in from external markets or native like blockchain based functions, or even let's say it's something like weather data? Are you running a network of weather sensors and people are paying you a couple cents a day to get accurate weather data? Maybe it's all mediated through native planet boxes and moon identities, and it's verified that way. And so I think that there's going to be, this is all to kind of like riff a little bit on how does Urbit let you upload these values? And the answer would be that the inverse of how an orderly and I think sane upload of values into the internet age is basically what we're seeing right now. And it's happening because of these centralized incentives to simply ship a commercial service. And we've let that run away with constructing the underpinnings of a digital society. So these are very good businesses. They're not civilizational primitives for a digital society. They weren't intended to be. But the technical paradigms they've locked in doom us to that centralized and cruft-laden technical layer to build everything else on.
Right.
And one thing that really attracted me about Urbit in the first place is that I've read a lot about the history of technology, and it's very apparent that there were all these different junctures where we had the opportunity to make vastly different choices in how we built technical infrastructure that underlies, again, this increasingly online society, but has, underlaid society for a long time now. Some of those choices we did very well at. I mean, in the early 90s, Bill Gates and I believe it was AOL wanted this entirely closed, internet namespace, and instead we got DNS. And DNS isn't perfect, but it's far better than what was being proposed back then.
Mhm.
Similarly, I mean, in the 80s, there was a lot of yelling from the government about even the prospect of allowing commercial traffic on the internet. My God.
Yeah.
There's a good history of open standards. I mean, SMTP arguably is the last open standard, although that even now is falling because for most people, email means Gmail, and so
Mhm.
it's on a Google server. And again, your Gmail address is just a line in the database. So there's a Urbit takes a bunch of design decisions that were made under entirely, contingent and now obsolete circumstances in the past and makes them differently. And I would argue an argument of much less scarcity and just very different, contingent conditions. So a big example of this would be that when decisions around, how to construct an overall computing environment were made, there was a bandwidth is expensive, hardware was expensive,
Mhm.
and technical knowledge was concentrated in a relatively small number of centers, whether those were industry labs, academia, etc. We're operating under a complete, and by the way, we also didn't have blockchain based identities, which I think are a very important piece of this puzzle. Now we're still using Linux, we're still using Unix based computing environments, which are have millions of lines of code to run these services, and we're still operating as though bandwidth is expensive and everyone needs to dial into a centralized server. These things aren't true anymore. We're acting as though lines in a database are the best identification technology we have. It's not true anymore. And so
And
that
having them replicated for every single service that we use over and over and over again.
yes, yes, which is a massive, which has its own kind of, political or civilizational risk, but it's also just massively redundant and it's a massive drag on
Yeah.
the economy. I mean, why should a VC fund the 20% of each, investment that does the same thing in a bespoke way? Now, occasionally maybe that's some sort of competitive advantage, but no, it's not really. It's a standard vendor fee that you're paying over and over and over again.
Mm.
And so from the investment perspective, by the way, this is one thing that we really like, and this is something that has traditionally made venture fortunes during the early stages of earlier, paradigmatic coordination tech revolutions, which is if there's an open core, then and Urbit is open source software, MIT license. Anyone can go buy a swath of planets for pennies on the dollar and deploy their own nodes. Anyone can ship software to all the Urbits in the world for free. Then all of a sudden you're paying much less per investment for the time and effort it takes to take a product idea to minimum viability. And that's what we see. We're investing in teams of 2 to 10 people that take a couple months to get a working prototype app that people are using out the door. There are exceptions. There are Urbit companies that are doing things that are more ambitious that take longer. We're invested in Zorp, which is doing a very interesting project called Nocchain,
Mm.
which is essentially using a deep part of the Urbit stack to create extremely inexpensive, ubiquitous, performant zero knowledge proofs. And that's definitely a more technically, sophisticated undertaking. But that still is using a part of the key Urbit, computational design philosophy, which is Nock is a simple instruction set, because you should be doing things simply, because you shouldn't rely on having hundreds of employees and giant server farms in order to run this civilizational infrastructure. And so I guess to put a cap on all this, the contingent conditions that our computing evolution was decided under are no longer relevant, and they weren't designed to hold the full weight of a civilization. Now our civilization is digital, and in order to rewind that clock, we have to go back to some of those decisions and say, okay, Was this designed with the full weight of the civilization intended? Or now do we have the latitude to actually explicitly take that into consideration rather than solving a narrow technical problem under niche and outmoded design constraints?
Mhm.
And fundamentally, that's what Urbit is. Urbit is sitting at the end of history, technologically speaking. And I don't mean the end of history, I mean the Fukuyaman, interregnum, where we finally got some degree of technological material abundance.
Mhm.
We have bandwidth, we have blockchains, we have relatively cheap server hardware. Um, Everyone can buy a native planet and run their Urbit locally if they want, or they can pay a couple bucks a month to stick it in the cloud bucket. Or for now, you can also get free hosting from several providers and say, okay, what can we build intentionally with actual knowledge that everything is going to rely on this? And that's basically what we're after here is how do you build the pillars of digital civilization at a point in time historically when it's become clear that things are going to need to rest on them for a very long time.
Wow. Yeah. So this is a basically starting over with a blank slate, more or less, to reimagine the internet, perhaps as it should have been, or at least in a way that if we weren't held to historical contingencies and certain technical constraints, material constraints in the past, which we're not anymore, how could we reshape things to really create a solid digital infrastructure? So I guess a few more questions before we get going here. We are running up on our time, but what kind of companies is Octu interested in taking a look at for potential investment?
Yeah, so we're interested in anything that again leverages the unique capabilities of Urbit to be competitive in an early marketplace. And so we're really open to a wide array of things, but a few, specific areas would be stuff that touches identity, reputation, stuff that coordinates resources in a way that wasn't possible already. Um, and specifically, I think we like companies that make markets. We like companies that go after. We're mostly focused, I'd say, realistically, a lot of things we look at are going to be building tools to then build other companies, services, et cetera, on. So maybe you could phrase that as B2B. But we also have some ideas about what we'd call crypto native prosumer, which is that Urbit is an OS for the crypto native, live player actor.
Hmm.
Um, and in many ways, there are tools to be built there that maybe aren't powering businesses, but they're powering people who want to, become self-sovereign. Um, and we also are very interested in specifically, so there's a couple of big technical upgrades coming to Urbit this summer, and the early iterations of these have just shipped. So new Mars, which is the runtime, makes the actual Urbit OS much quicker, much
Hmm.
faster. uh, and then there are AIMS networking upgrades, particularly something called Remote Scry, which allows for data caching and which allows for basically a much faster network. And so a lot of the companies that we're seeing in our pipeline right now are very conscious of this. And so there's a lot more performant things that can be built right now in terms of active interaction. So maybe some of these things will start to protocolize, things that were formerly in the SaaS domain. And those are definitely things to be cognizant of right now.
Hmm. And with anyone that's listening to this conversation, whether you are familiar with Urbit or are just learning about it for the first time, the whole ecosystem, I mean, even as someone, I've known about Urbit for maybe maybe a decade now. And the whole ecosystem can be a little bit intimidating and seem somewhat daunting to even begin approaching, even as a technical person. So where would you recommend someone begin their journey into getting into the Urbit ecosystem and potentially getting involved?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of good resources out there. The urbit.org blog is great, and some of those are going to be a little bit deeper technically, but there's also, if you dig around, there's some great explainers from various people. There's been some. The Zero K podcast is great, which you can find on Spotify, YouTube, and I believe they have a Twitter presence as well. And that's again a bit variable. Sometimes that's an interview with a dev, sometimes that's an interview with a community member that demystifies Urbit from the newbie perspective. Um, I'd also encourage, shameless plug, Octu Ventures is our website, and we have a white paper that I think presumes a little bit understanding of Urbit, but it also explains our perspective on what it is, maybe shorn of some of the willful obscurantism that certainly exists out there. Um, and then honestly, the best way to get involved, and the one that I've seen the most people have success with, is to go boot a planet. So Red Horizon or Tlon both have free planet hosting. Boot a planet, you'll get dumped into the Urbit community group, ask as many questions. People are super nice. And I mean, the community is really, really special, and it has been for a long time. We really haven't seen any kind of like Eternal September events, even as it has grown by since the time I first got involved. I think about an order of magnitude. And really, it's a bit of a cliche to say that it is what you make it, but really, we've seen people show up and build some really astounding both creative and technical projects inside the community. And I think it mostly just comes from a place of showing up and kind of like banging on reality in terms of what people want to get involved in. One thing to note right now is that there's a brand new project called Fund. This is the percentage sign and then FUND.
Mm-hmm.
And we can probably link that in the show notes. And this is an Urbit native crowdfunding app that people are, crowdfunding for their own little technical and creative projects on. And so, yeah, I think that really jumping with both feet, and certainly there's a lot of activity on Twitter. I think some of that's probably kind of the willful obscurantism. But there's a lot of people happy to explain this stuff as well. And I will say that it is also just it's a genuinely, broad project. So, there's a lot of facets that, deserve to be explored. And it's not something you can probably fully, understand in an afternoon or a week. But it's also something where the fundamentals are pretty straightforward, I think.
All right. That's our show. Nick, thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much, Alex.